So we are soon to be live.
Yes, we should be live right now.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So welcome everyone. On behalf of Thomas Bayer and myself, we are the conveners of this lecture series on health crises. And today we have a wonderful guest speaker, Professor Anne Kelly, whom I will introduce in a moment. Anne will talk about global health and the global health dimension of health crises and what challenges health crises pose for global health. And I think this session is particularly important because in public discourse, when we think about health crises and global health, and in particular COVID and global health, we think mostly about COVAX, the vaccine sharing program that was a mixed success, if we can put it this way. But global health it matters in so many more ways. It matters in the sense that there's a very unequal distribution of resources, of power within societies. We've discussed this already in previous sessions, but also across societies. Also, power and knowledge is an important dimension. So what types of diseases are worth being investigated and addressed in the first place? And as is well known by now, the idea among some people in the world that infectious diseases are a problem of the South, of poor countries, allegedly poor countries, has contributed to COVID becoming the global crisis that it is. So our speaker today is Professor Anne Kelly. She's a professor in anthropology and global health. She is also the head of department of a wonderful department at King's College London, the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine. Anne is a trained anthropologist. She has a PhD in anthropology from Cambridge, and she has done a lot of work on the conditions that structure the production of knowledge and also of action in global health. She has done work on infectious disease control and also on how we can improve health systems. And as many of our speakers here, she's somebody who hasn't only thought and researched about these topics, but she has also done a lot of things herself to improve things and to make the world a better place, if I can put it in these terms. So, Anne, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Barbara. And it is a wonderful department because Barbara is a key pillar in its foundation. So there's a long shadow there. I'm going to start sharing my slides. Do let me know if they don't come through. Are they visible? Everything's good?
Perfect.
Great. So again, it's just such a joy to be here. I was really honored for the invitation and to be part of this wide-ranging and really, I think, important set of conversations that this lecture series has been pursuing, and how important it is thinking about health crisis. I mean, as Barbara says, across societies, within societies, different kinds of disciplines and communities of practice. What I want to talk today, again, as Barbara said, from the perspective of global health and as an anthropologist working in this field, is this question about how we think about health crises as a kind of interplay of different values. And I'm sure over the past few weeks, when you've been thinking through COVID, there's nothing, a kind of clear lesson is that health crises are social and political phenomena to their core, not only in terms of the dynamics of transmission, but also in terms of the policy decisions about how they're brought, how those dynamics are brought under control, or in some cases entrenched and amplified. And of course, those decisions are driven by values, right? Our kind of values about, whose lives matter, whose lives are we going to prioritize, what sets of trade-offs do we pursue in protecting different kind of segments of the society, and how we collectively imagine what a good course of action, what the good life looks like. So I think, one kind of thinking in the kind of global purview is how do those values come to be adjudicated, especially across very different sets of priorities and, as Barbara mentioned, different contexts of power. So I just wanted to kind of open up first, just very basic, and just to throw it open to anyone in the audience, if we could have just kind of a working definition of what is global health? What do we mean when we say global health? And if anyone, again, I apologize to throw it to you so early, but if anyone has just a brief definition of what's the difference between global health and public health, what do we mean when we talk about global health?
And you can answer in English or in German. If you answer in German, we will translate.
I know it's a tricky one. It's like the kinds of things that we all assume we know. Anyone in the chat? Any hands? Or Barbara?
Let's see whether Nora or Elias can have a go, if no, just to break the ice. Super, Elias.
I just entered the lecture, but I can try to give a definition.
Yes,
global
go.
health would be the situation of the global state of health risks, not in a sense of how is each individual doing, but more in are there any threats to all the individuals as a society, for example, in a pandemic, because of a pandemic that will impact the functioning of global societies everywhere.
That's excellent. Right. So there's something grander. I also see a hand from Oliver.
Yeah, I just thought on the health definition of the World Health Organization, which also includes cultural and social dimensions. So I think global health also should like cover a global cultural of a global culture of health and a global like social structure of health. So like both on the state level, but I think also on the social level. So we like, yeah.
Excellent. I mean, I think you've both kind of tagged two kind of key components of, how we think about global health as something specific, right? It is, on one hand, it addresses a set of problems, right, that kind of transcend national boundaries, right, that cannot be kind of answered. And that might be problems kind of classically around, pandemics and infections that move across boundaries. Or, I mean, as Elias first said, kind of, we might want to look at, wider scale trends around, maybe obesity, health, nutrition that require a different set of tools to think, how are we the political economy of food, for instance, that might require more than just a kind of state approach. Excellent point by Oliver, just thinking about how, if these are questions that are not just state bound, what kind of practices, how do we define the ways in which, global health interventions work? And they might be, if they're transnational, we might have to think about different ideas of health and disease. It might require a whole bunch of different disciplines that are both the kind of social sciences, the political sciences, different forms of collaboration. And also, I mean, I've put this kind of key point about being a pragmatism in the sense that if you're dealing in a kind of global context, questions of, resourcing, how do you trade off, what's workable, what's doable in the context of kind of different problems and states. Now, there's a third kind of element of global health, and I think we're touching on this in terms of, social questions, is that there's a kind of normative vision, right? When we say global health, packed into that is an objective, right? We want health for the world. And in that is this idea that we're going to reduce somehow global health inequities And part of that is this mission of achieving justice in health research and healthcare. So kind of question of equity. And I just wanted to ask one more kind of question to the group about, does anyone have an idea of the kind of difference between, what a health inequality versus, or what or equity means when we're talking about equity or inequity or justice? Because these words are kind of thrown around. We think things are unequal. Well, what are we talking about when we talk about inequity?
And as a hint, but for those of you who are German speakers, the German language doesn't have an exact equivalent to those terms. So do you have any idea of what the difference could be between something that is unequal and something that is not equitable?
Oh, this is an unfair question.
Ja, aber Entschuldigung, ich weiß, das ist nicht exakt dasselbe. Oh, Entschuldigung, jetzt bin ich auf Deutsch geswitcht. Aber es gibt doch Ungleichheit und es gibt doch Ungleichheit und Ungerechtigkeit also im Deutschen. So, es ist nicht, ich weiß schon, es ist nicht exakt so die Differenz zwischen Inequity und Inequality. Aber ich glaube, es geht schon in die Richtung. So.
Yeah, so Oliver made a very good point. He said in German doesn't have the difference between inequity and inequality, but there's a difference sometimes made between something that is unjust and something that is unequal. And Oliver said that sort of goes in that direction.
That's, and I think that's, it's so interesting how important those kind of linguistic distinctions are. I have there's a kind of classic kind of diagram that helps to think through the difference between equality, equity, and justice, right? So one, equality, everyone gets the same thing, but equity addresses kind of what people need in order to achieve the same output, right? So, I mean, in the diagram, for everyone to see over the fence, the shorter person is going to need a different size box than the taller person, right? But there's a kind of third question, and I think this has really come to greater articulation post-COVID, is questions of, is justice? How do you remove the fence in the first place? Like, how do you think of the broader structural questions, which give us the conditions and problems between inequitable conditions, which, over that point about, what is just versus, equality might begin to look at some of those questions. So I think, just again, thinking now where we are in global health and the kinds of conversations, and back to this issue that Barbara really helped flag about, kind of the structures of power that, underlay any kind of global cooperation, is a movement towards thinking more about how you decolonize global health. Now, there are many kind of, there's the kind of politics of language about thinking about what decolonization means, but essentially captures the idea that, global health, there's a lineage, right, of global health that you can trace from the colonial period up through international aid to global health. And it's basically a kind of story of benign help, but structured by an idea that there is an other, right, that you are intervening in, whether it's giving them, giving kind of charitable health, or, you're actually intervening in these lives for your own interests. There's been a couple papers recently out, and I've put a quote here, which can nicely summarizes that. Global health has evolved from colonial and tropical medicine, which were designed to control colonized populations and make political and economic exploitation by European and North American powers easier. The operations of many organizations active in global health thus perpetuate the very power imbalances they claim to rectify through colonial and extractive attitudes and policies and practices that concentrate resources, expertise, data, and branding within high-income countries. So it's, it's a real clarion call of saying, yes, even though, we are the objective, the normative moral goal is health for all, that there are ways of doing that actually just continue to exacerbate the same kinds of imbalances that will always put one set of countries at the service of another. Right? So kind of one question is, where do we move from there? And I think, one of the more interesting aspects, and I will say one of the great thinkers on this issue happens to be on structuring the series, is the questions of how do we rethink solidarity in terms of global health? Who is it? What are the kind of communities and forms of action through which we can rethink intervention? And again, people have began to say, who do we look to if it's not to the kind of classic institutions of high income countries? Who are the researchers, who are the local communities that we can begin to rethink where our kind of connections, our transnational sets of operations of working to address problems in global health. So again, how do we, if we're going to really address equity, we need to empower those who are who are the most marginalized to begin to articulate what problems need to be solved and how. And I wanted to put up a great line here from Professor Prensek about, how we think about the distinctions between charity, right, which could emerge from a moral or religious duty on the side of those who are rich to give to the poor because they are different. Within solidarity, support emerges across societal and economic differences due to the things people have in common. So, just to say that when we think about, I think, rooting out common assumptions about global health, moving away from a model which is intervening in the lives of others, right, through a kind of charitable moral obligation, to saying, how do we allow people to articulate problems from the ground up, and what ways can we find of working that, again, are going to be transnational, are going to be across border, that aren't going to be state-based, but that don't follow the same lines of north to south transfer and, retain itself in that same kind of colonial lineage. So that's kind of a big, backdrop to thinking about where the global health conversation is going now. And, please, anyone stop me if they want to kind of clarify, but I thought kind of the best way to think through what's at stake and why this kind of querying the global health way of operating is to work through an example. And I know that you guys have been talking a lot about COVID, but the example I want to turn to is Ebola. And I think Ebola is a really interesting story, really interesting case to look at the dynamics of how global health frames its object, what kind of solutions become possible, and what kinds of values get prioritized, is because Ebola has made this really interesting transition at this moment that I'm going to focus on, which is the Ebola outbreak in 2014, 2016. There's been a number before that, and there's been a series of continuing ones after that. But this kind of outbreak, really, you see the jump of Ebola from becoming from a neglected disease into a global health emergency. And one of the things I find quite interesting to follow in that is how Ebola, depending on how it's understood as either a public health problem or a kind of issue of communities, or as a humanitarian crisis, and ultimately as a biosecurity threat, those different framings involve a different set of solutions and a different set of actors and a different set of techniques in order to address the problem, right? So it's a virus, it is a biological entity, but depending on how you think about this, what kind of scale is the problem, who is at risk, and what kind of value you have for control completely determines how you're going to respond to it and the solutions that are possible. And within that, you see a really interesting interplay between how Ebola is kind of brought to attention, how we know it as a problem, and what kinds of neglect are built into that bringing of attention. Who is kind of prioritized, and who is kind of obscured in the different ways Ebola is thought as a problem. And I'm going to try to I have kind of three short sections and kind of thinking about moments in the Ebola outbreak as kind of as instances where where it becomes a global health phenomenon, and what becomes possible once Ebola is framed in that way. Are we good? Everyone's good? So I just want to, again, just throw it up for 1 second. I have a couple of cartoons from the outbreak. I don't know how many people remember so well. It's now, I can't believe it's been a number of years now since the 2014 Ebola outbreak. But I wonder if anyone just has a response to kind of what is this cartoon, what's the commentary in this image? You know, what's the, it's, you know, it's a kind of macabre joke, but what is the artist trying to convey in this comic? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that refers to the fact that I think for 1 or 2 days, the report of the Ebola outbreak was in the media immediately after the Medicines Sans Frontières. Oh, my French is not so good. But when this organization, or even the World Health Organization, went to press with that, it was in the media like 1 or 2 days, and then nobody ever talked about that. And like I think it the number even is from Wikipedia, if I remember correctly. I think 2 years ago or so, I just looked it up on Wikipedia, and that was the number from like 2 years ago. Like, so they like that it's, yeah, it was in the media for 2 days, and then nobody ever like was interested in that anymore, in the epidemic or pandemic.
Exactly. So it was, you know, we have this problem, right? As you said, MSF calling in saying, you know, can anyone hear me? And then, you know, any reason, any just thoughts on kind of why was this disease not captured in the media? You know, why did it not come to anyone's attention? Why is MSF alone there? Because it happened in Africa. Yes, thank you, Beatrice. Perfect. Yes, okay, exactly. So we have, it's happening in Africa, right? This kind of sense of, you have this continent, it's neglect. I mean, it's quite interesting. You mentioned kind of the numbers came up, and looking back and you think about COVID, the idea that I think in the end it was, you know, there was about 28,000 cases, roughly 11,000 deaths, which now seems quite small. But, you know, up until this point, Ebola, you know, outbreaks were, you know, I think 400 had been the most, you know, had been the largest. So this was an exceptionally large outbreak comparatively. And we'll talk a little bit about why, you know, it had a kind of particular set of concerns that eventually develop about it. So we have it's Africa, it doesn't matter. There's, you know, there's this outbreak raising, MSF, you know, on the ground is calling to the world. Now, the second comic I want to just bring is this one. And if anyone just had any thoughts about kind of what is going on here. They're left alone with the situation. Right, exactly. So it's an interesting, I mean, if you compare both of these, right, at different moments, you have one early on where Africa is neglected because it's Africa, right? And then the minute, then even once it becomes a problem that is of global health attention, right, it's still in some sense neglected, right? It's just kind of quarantined off, right? Because this is part of what, you know, even in the context of global health attention, very little difference is, between here and here, even as this kind of moment where Ebola goes from an object of neglect to an object of, you know, global health concern, for the people who are afflicted, not a lot has changed, right? So this is the kind of question posed by, you know, the lecturers just saying, you know, how do we account for that kind of, you know, stability for the same situation for these populations as we move between a situation of total disinterest to all of a sudden complete focus? So just to give a bit of background on how do we get to it becoming a global health emergency, just if we look, again, at kind of where the outbreak timeline, they trace back, there's a patient 0 who is in kind of Guinea forestière, small child, originally thought that, although they still haven't found the exact kind of smoking gun, from a bat, right? So there's a spillover event. It's a viral hemorrhagic fever, affects a child. And for multiple months, you have transmission going on without anyone noticing. There's actually an outbreak currently in the DRC, and it's very interesting following the media because it was 2 weeks before they identified the case, and there was much anxiety that it had been 2 weeks. Whereas in this outbreak, you're looking at 6 months, right? Almost 5 months of just transmission. So once Ebola virus is confirmed, MSF comes to set up units because they have been the de facto respondent to Ebola, because they have the kind of technique and experience in order to handle it. It is a disease that if you are actually handling patients, if you are caring for patients, if you're handling bodies, if you're very close contact, it's very contagious. It is not airborne. So it is never going to be like COVID, right? It requires a physical contact in order to spread. So, MSF sets up. The WHO says this is a kind of this is a state-based emergency, internal. This is not something to be hugely worried about. We know outbreaks. We've managed them before. However, something happens in the following months and transmission explodes, right? It hits the capitals. There are multiple riots in countries. There's a case in Lagos, which sends everyone into terror because it's the huge, most populous city. And MSF calls the situation out of control, and really out of step with MSF's operations calls for military support. They don't usually do that. So by the time we get into August, September, there's been a US missionary infected, which, as you can imagine, having white missionaries infected and coming back causes a different degree of concern and interest. And the UN steps in, and the WHO declares a public health emergency of international concern, which is the category that was given to COVID. And I'm sure some of you will recognize the term fake at this point. So what is, just to remind us, is a public health emergency of international concern? Well, it's by definition an extraordinary event, right? And this is really important as part of the classification, is that it is something that is not only kind of determines a risk that is transnational, but really implies immediate international solidarity and action, right? And that it's something unusual or unexpected. So, one of the most interesting, I think, aspects about the pandemics and COVID is how do you act and react in a situation of a knowledge deficit, right? You don't know what's happening, you have a lack of expertise, and you have to craft policy and response into that vacuum where you don't know, should we wear masks? Should we not wear masks? Are people, how far is airborne virus? Many kind of scientific questions come up. So what was extraordinary about this outbreak? Well, when it started, again, Ebola is something that had been a kind of, it happened in Africa, outbreaks from the 70s. It had been a kind of problem, but one that really required kind of very specific small interventions because it had really happened mostly in rural areas where populations are diffuse and were in some respect, even despite the high mortality, easy to flame out and contain. What was different about the West African Ebola outbreak was that it was a new territory. There's a lot of scientific debate. It was said this is the first time it had occurred in West Africa. People argued that maybe people hadn't seen it before. There hadn't been scientific response, but in contrast to kind of the previous rural outbreaks, this is across a really densely populated areas, urban areas, a lot of informal settlements and slums with a lack of basic infrastructure. You're also dealing with an exceptionally poor population, right? And I think one of the interesting distinctions is that a lot of across the Mana River region, which includes Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia, very kind of ethnically interconnected, so a lot of cross-border traffic, but very distinct colonial histories, right? So you have the French presence in Guinea, Americans in Liberia, and the British in Sierra Leone, which left very different kinds of public health legacies and structures. And in some sense, a lot of histories of kind of distrust with that public health engagement. The other key thing to think about, this is a post-conflict region. There have been civil war for many years across, and really devastating the region. And at the point of the outbreak, there's about, I think stats said, 1 doctor per 100,000 people. I looked it up. I think comparatively in Austria, it's 532 doctors per 100,000. So really, I mean, in terms of a kind of tinderbox for an outbreak to set, this was quite different, and really a very challenging context in which both to kind of launch a control response. The other interesting issue, and this is a key part of kind of how all of a sudden the outbreak went from some issue of neglect, right, to a kind of global phenomenon, is the first kind of projections, because a key bit of what makes global health global is being able to articulate it in metrics, right, so that we can see it across populations and what data. And the first epidemiological analyses and from the WHO response team kind of projected a very worrying picture of where this outbreak was going. And quite interestingly, is that they had a set of, very worrying numbers. This was obviously a much bigger outbreak than anything that happened before. But what they postulated is that they, in addition to that, the data that they had, that because of the lack of health infrastructure and the big data holes, that actually the real numbers, that there was a shadow epidemic that they couldn't even anticipate. So, in their kind of big New England Journal Medicine population, they said, we have these projections, but the numbers that we have are certainly, they're much higher, right? So because there are many people evading diagnosis, there's a lot of, the health infrastructure isn't good. So even what we have here doesn't fully grasp how bad the situation is. And if you look at the paper, it's quite interesting. What they did is they took the numbers that they had and then multiplied them by 2.5, which was their correction factor, saying, well, we're going to anticipate that because of underreporting, we're just going to multiply whatever these numbers have by this correction factor. So they get a much steeper epidemiological curve and projection of infection. Now, this seems a bit granular, but it becomes incredibly important, because all of a sudden you have an outbreak that's bad, right? But then it can be modeled and projected to be really bad, right? There's this classic, I don't know if there's a word for this, use this in German, the hockey stick, which is the kind of point of inflection, right? And where exponential growth happens with disease, right? So once it's, you see this in tipping points, in climate change, that once you get past a certain threshold, the outbreak becomes a feature of its own scale, right? It starts spreading and spreading and spreading. And, this was a graph I put up because you have, up until the orange, you have the kind of the cases, but then you have the projected cases, right? Which is getting to 14,000. I mean, the CDC at one point was suggesting 1.5 million cases of Ebola, which is a very different kind of problem, right? And you go from a regional issue to one that is all of a sudden, across the globe. And that, gets people's attention. You get a lot of graphs. And, just again, it's important. I think it's quite helpful when it's post-COVID, everyone I think is very alive to the power of certain kinds of numerical logic and to the rhetoric of certain kinds of visuals, because we've all been re-indoctrinated into like watching and attending to the reporting on outbreaks to understand like how they move certain kinds of policy and what can garner kind of public attention and concern. And you see a lot of these, kinds of representations of this outbreak out of control, right? And Ebola has a very specific, even though it's like highly neglected, it's, it is the kind of classic pandemic nightmare movie, right? It is the scenario of viral hemorrhagic fever. It wipes out. It's a particularly gruesome way to die. And it suddenly becomes part of a kind of apocalyptic register of fantasy. And bearing in mind, remember that Ebola still is quite difficult to catch unless you are caring for someone. So it is not like COVID. It is it was never going to approximate the kind of pandemic that we've seen. And indeed, very early on in the pandemic, there's a quick kind of checking of the models and this kind of, pushback on saying, how forecasts can go wrong, how models, it's far less devastating than predicted, what did the epidemiologists get wrong in overestimating the Ebola cases, right? There's this kind of pushback. And again, I think you see this in COVID, which is, how did these modelers get this so wrong? It was not even close to being that bad. And I think it's, there's a very interesting set of responses from the modelers that I wanted to kind of flag here, right? So this is from Martin Meltzer from the CDC. We were telling policymakers that if we don't do this, this will happen. Accuracy for the sake of accuracy is merely interesting, and interesting is not good enough. This is Neil Ferguson, who also became quite important in the UK response to COVID, led the WHO Ebola response team. One of their purposes, he's talking about the models, was to wake up the world and say that this could be really bad if we don't do anything. The result was a series of warnings that altered the world. And Chris Whitty, our chief medical officer, models showed us what we needed to do. They made us move. And I just want to pause here and wonder if anyone had any thoughts about how they, those kinds of rationales about models and their purpose, that accuracy is not good enough. Do people feel like that's a reasonable position, or would they push back?
And if I may jump in, I'm not quite sure I understand your question. I'm puzzled by the last statement. I would not vouch for that. I think it's kind of passive. Clearly, we need models, but models need good data. And so I think models can be a support act, but they don't take away the responsibility of foresight and acting in a mature way. So the last one, I don't know. In fact, I don't know all these abbreviations except for WHO, but it's not my turf because I come from physics. It's kind of difficult. What puzzles me about the first statement is that indirectly there is this opposition statement, me versus the policymakers. I think if we want to tackle the obvious issues of global health, it needs to also entail a more holistic approach to understanding that we're all part of this. And I might misread this statement, but we should conceive of these different entities as part of society, and, if you will, a global organization to address the challenges of global health. So while I agree with everything you say, it sounds very sensible, I also see a bit of a imposed friction in all this of me thinking good and doing well against those who have missed the turning point or have not acted. And I think we need to overcome this. So it's a bit of a convoluted response. But to answer your question, we need models, and models need good data. And this means the engagement, or entails the engagement of many people like Médecins Sans Frontières, but also local national health offices, if they exist. And if they don't, perhaps that's one way of supporting, as a global world, supporting remote or more remote areas in providing them with the means of collecting these data. And I think one way, what we will see probably in 20 years from now, is that trackers that everybody is using, or think of the African population with a very dense use of mobile phones. I think we will be using this technology much more to come up, or to make up for the lack of institutions in certain areas. So that was a convoluted response to your question.
And it's incredibly helpful, because I think this question, I think what was interesting in the Ebola case was how important, and sitting in on some of those early days of the WHO, where the decision to call it an emergency or not really depended upon these kinds of, I remember, Margaret Chan, who was then the director, saying, it's not the numbers that matter, but the shape of the curve, and what the shape of the curve says. And I think, I have so much respect and time for modelers. Like, I think it's incredibly difficult in situations of uncertainty to begin to offer what might be a forecast, right? And, I think, there was a lot of critique of saying, how did they get it so wrong that millions didn't die from this? And I think I was just very compelled by and interested that the argument that said, well, maybe they could have if people, this kind of interesting kind of counterfactual, where there's a sense of, well, if no one does anything, this will rage out of control. And, how are models held up for a future that they're actually trying to intervene in? Barbara, sorry, I'm rambling.
No, not at all. Yeah, you're the speaker. So I think the question of modeling is a very, very important one. And I'm really grateful that you brought it up. And here, I would like to also remind everyone that on the 7th of June, we will have one of the master modelers, Stefan Thuner, here in the seminar series. But I think I do support your point, and in the sense that, if I understand you correctly, in the sense that, yes, models are incredibly helpful. They help us look, act upon the future in ways that we otherwise could not. But I think what we've seen in the COVID pandemic is that the model, despite everyone's knowledge that the model is a model of the world and not a faithful representation of everything that's going on, it took on this role. So because there was so little to hold on to, the model became the world that we intervened upon, at least in some policy circles. And the second point I think that you raise is the politics of visibility, also with some of your earlier statements. So one could even say, I'm playing the devil's advocate here, we talk about decolonization, but we maintain the instruments and metrics of colonial powers by saying that this type of evidence is the only one that counts. Mm-hmm. And to make it more tangible, we have ignored a huge amount, and you've done some work on this, of course, and also Hannah Kienzler and others, David Ruby, we have ignored a lot of non-quantified knowledge from many countries on how infectious diseases how the spread of infectious diseases can be limited, how infectious diseases can be contained. So everything that wasn't legible in a particular form that certain types of machines could read were ignored. So this doesn't mean that we should throw out models, obviously. But I think the point that you raise is a very important one. So what politics of visibility do we trust and enforce? And what does it mean that some crises, health crises and other crises, aren't visible because they cannot be datafied in the right way?
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting in this case is almost this kind of multiplication, the correction factor was a way of kind of embedding a sense of the illegible, right? That there are dynamics that could not, be captured. And I think, I mean, the question, and you've set me up perfectly here, is, what are the politics of visibility? But then, what kinds of visibility once that those metrics render possible? And, this is why I think the question of kind of where the models get us is the kinds of response that immediately become necessary in a situation of this, this kind of projected outbreak. So, once Ebola becomes visible. It becomes visible, in certain kinds of ways. And, I just wanted to put up this kind of news brief from the US reporting on Ebola once, it became a kind of media question. And I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about the kind of the ISIS of biological agents and thinking about Ebola in that way. To provide just a bit of context, because this is a while ago, this is at this point, Obama is the American president, and it was right before the midterm elections where there was a very big, push from the opposing side, from Republicans. And there's this kind of concern, Ebola, is brought into the US through people who have been affected working in the field. And there's this equation, right, of Ebola, as here's a president that allows kind of ISIS and terror and Ebola to come into the country, right? And there's this, I think, a lot of slippage between what kinds of threats do our politics open us up to? And it's very important, this idea of kind of thinking about Ebola as a threat rather than a problem. And I think rather than a kind of average public health problem. There was a GoFundMe campaign to gain kind of, investment in the disaster in West Africa in 2014, which garnered almost no response. And it's interesting to think about, comparatively, why Ebola as a kind of public health issue and disaster and catastrophe in the country can gain a kind of set of sympathies that or lack of sympathy that you would expect to see in a kind of charitable response to, say, a hurricane or an earthquake, right? And, we can think a little bit about why that would be the case. But one, of course, is that Ebola is understood as partly a situation which is these people have brought upon themselves, right? There is a sense of kind of blame of infection. And again, that kind of who is infected and blame is something that we see later with COVID. But once we get kind of recognizing Ebola as actually there is a visibility to it as a problem and as a significant one, the UN Security Council calls the outbreak actually a problem of security, right? This is one of this is the first time that they organize an emergency health mission. And the rationale is that because Ebola outbreak is occurring in countries that are, incredibly fragile with fragile states, is that this is more than just a health issue, right? This is going to undermine the stability of the region. So it is a security question. Now, the only other disease that has been securitized in the same way previously is HIV. But again, we've had this kind of, it's a reframing of a kind of issue of health, disease, illness to civil unrest, right? Social tensions and kind of state fragility, which is a very different kind of object of concern and attention than just, something that requires therapeutics, for instance. So what kind of response do we get to once it's deemed a kind of security problem? Well, you need security measures. Again, these are ones that now we're quite familiar with, but were, seen quite extreme at the time. Security measures are ones that focus on the preventative and protection essentially from a threat, right? So this is about, you see kind of border surveillance, transit restrictions, population control, curfew, quarantine, lockdown. It's about kind of protecting an outside population from further infection, right? So there's a kind of anticipatory logic. It's also kind of security measures happen in a kind of space of exceptionality, and you see the kind of dynamics of command and control, right? So you might see loosened regulatory protocols or the kinds of governmental frameworks that might constrain states, whether it's, releasing experimental therapies or kind of allowing different, emergency measures to flow. But also, this kind of attenuation of human rights and suspension of civil liberties in that case. And you're allowed to exercise that kind of sovereign command in a situation because it's deemed absolutely necessary and then it's going to be time limited, right? There's a kind of time set of constraints. But, again, these are the kinds of measures that come in because you're dealing with the population that might be a threat to other populations, right? So you see kind of a move away from kind of the curative of the individual to a kind of containing of a problem that might bleed over into other populations. And what is the issue, right? I mean, one is the infection, but again, at this point where it becomes a security problem, you have a kind of community as the site of problem of resistance. And there was a lot of language early on in the outbreak where, the problem of Ebola outbreak isn't just one that there is a disease that's circulating, but that actually the communities themselves are at issue. So there's a lot of discussion in kind of the WHO response that there's, the existence of numerous shadow zones. These are villages where rumors of cases and deaths with strong suspicion of Ebola as the cause that cannot be investigated because of community resistance or lack of adequate staff and vehicles. So you have, this figure of kind of very fragile states, but also rogue populations that are the core of the problem, right? Margaret Chan, leading kind of the WHO response, says, well, part of the issue here is cultural, right? These are deep-seated beliefs and cultural practices are a significant cause, right? They are the cause of further spread and significant barrier to rapid and effective containment. Now, again, I think it's quite interesting how seeing this from the wake of COVID, the problem, the social as a problem, and the kind of lack of understanding of populations or the failure of people to do it right become the object of public health concern. But at this point, Margaret, it's a big step saying, this social dimension must be addressed. Now, because it's Africa and because it's exotic, this is where, anthropologists come in because they know about issues that are cultural. And there was a lot of discussion about kind of what were the kind of key cultural factors. Barbara, yes.
And could you go back to your previous
yes.
slide?
Sorry, not that one.
I find this really fascinating, and I had not seen that quote in 2014. So it strikes me because, as you said, and maybe I'm overinterpreting it, in which case Thomas, I'm sure, will intervene. When, as you said, the culture and the practice are happening somewhere in the global south, then it is something that needs to be addressed and changed. Mm-hmm. And when it's in the global north, then, well, it still needs to be addressed, but it's very much also acknowledged as a matter of freedom, right? The freedom and individual autonomy and choice. So there's this careful balancing between how far into individual freedom public health interventions may infringe upon, well, to what extent they may infringe upon or limit individual freedoms. So it is striking that in this case, it was not discussed in terms of people's individual freedoms and autonomy to enact their religious beliefs, but it was seen as a problem that is the cause of the spread of the pandemic. So I think, drawing a parallel to what goes on today, this is quite telling, I think.
Oh, hugely. And I think, it's interesting, and not to speak, from personal experience. It was, in Ebola, there was a lot of call for anthropologists to look at cultural practice, right? To see what were these problematic practices. And, they were nicely outlined, as get into this as, bushmeat consumption, right? They were kind of these exotic practices that caused Ebola that were of concern, these illness beliefs and behaviors and burial rituals. And you can see these handbooks where you get these kind of representations of these wild, crazy funeral parties of, the man with the machete, the woman dressing the wounds. I mean, there's a kind of idiom of cultural practice. I will tell you, no one during COVID was interested in any anthropological expertise anywhere. Not that I'm, feel badly about that, but it's because, as you say, this is not a cultural issue anymore, right? This is a issue of kind of, public value or public, concern. So there was this call for these kinds of attentions to these areas of, cultural vectors of disease, which is a hugely, I think, problematic way of thinking about culture, and ways of kind of how, an anthropological attention might be able, as you say, to kind of change, right? To change people's deep-seated beliefs or, backwards set of assumptions. Now, there's a lot more to say about this, but, I just wanted to kind of provide one example. Early on in the outbreak, there was a lot of kind of, representations about bushmeat, right? Because the issue being that this was a spillover event it was a zoonotic disease, which, as kind of COVID was, or there's some debate about that, but presumably COVID was as well. And a part of, I think, the kind of repugnance of Ebola, because, Ebola stirs up a lot of fear, but also this kind of sense, I would say, of, disgust, right? Was its associations with this kind of wild meat bush trade. And there was a very kind of problematic, news cover about, apes being eaten, brought into, and that this is a cause of spread. So the kind of one of the first policy measures, because of course, at this point in the outbreak, there was no therapeutics, there was no licensed vaccines, there was nothing. So the first policy effort was actually to put a massive ban on bushmeat across the region. Now, there's a number of reasons why, so many reasons why this was not a good idea. The first of which is actually an epidemiological one. It's one spillover event, right? One unfortunate kid meets one sick bat, and that's it. And then it's human to human transmission. So arguably you could have a bushmeat ban that might have a preventative purpose for future outbreaks. But in general, in terms of responding to the current outbreak, putting a ban on bushmeat is not going to do much. It also, in this particular context, it reverberated across a very specific set of politics where regions where where people, where there's hunting in the kind of forested regions feel at distance from the kind of politics of the capital. And there was this sense of real vulnerable and kind of it just exacerbated the sense that these populations had already been oppressed by populations in north and by populations in the city. So once you put a bushmeat ban in, and where people were fined for hunting, there is an issue, people not, being able to eat, not being able to trade, but also feeling like, that Ebola is suspect, that this is another kind of political movement by powers that are there to oppress people. And I was part of a project that was looking at the impact of the ban on these communities. And what was so interesting is that, a kind of 2 points. One is that there was this kind of association of the ban, not just with the government, but also MSF. So there was a kind of confusion over who was instituting this ban of eating bushmeat. And also just kind of what it did to kind of to community trust, both in the response, but in each other. And I just highlighted this part of this quote where it said, we no other source of meat. We just had to pay what was asked. Everything must be done in secret, right? So these bans came in and there was a whole set of kind of, accusations, and it really kind of fractured communities. The other was it kind of ran against people's experiences. And, in these discussions, what is said, it doesn't conform, this idea that monkeys are causing Ebola, because I eat it all the time. I'm eating it now. I'm like, I've tried it. I've tried it with my family. It seems fine. So there was this kind of complete miscommunication between a policy priority and how people were experiencing, the outbreak and the cause. And again, it's amazing feeling the resonances with COVID. There was a massive kind of pushback about kind of Ebola being a hoax, it being a kind of pretext for colonial governments or corrupt governments to gain money from the north, or to further oppress people who had been oppressed. and that, this is just doesn't, not from any sense of deep irrationality, but of local styles of reasoning and experience that just expose this as an irrational event. So just to round up, here is to kind of remind us, and again, Thomas, I completely, this is not to raise the point that there is a kind of model that is like us versus them, or, global health responses are bad. But I mean, to Barbara's point, is how do we have a kind of symmetrical understanding of how people respond in situations, not, irrationality with deep cultural, deep-seated beliefs, but with, very defendable styles of reasoning to situations which are completely out of control. So, I mean, first kind of thing to recognize an outbreak is, people might not prioritize the risks. You could say to someone, well, if you hold your child with Ebola, you're going to die. You can't respond to them. This is not safe. But, will I prioritize that? Right? I might indeed hold my child when they're sick, even if I know that there's a risk involved, right? That traditions, perform key social functions. And there was a big debate about kind of, funerals, that we should just cremate the bodies. That's much safer. But for someone who believes that kind of, that abdicating that responsibility for a proper burial might have spiritual repercussions that are worse than death, they will not prioritize that either. Another kind of key lesson that this response had to come to grips with was that telling people to go to Ebola treatment units or seek out proper biomedical expertise, again, wasn't a matter of kind of people having, deep-seated traditional beliefs, but that their experiences of the health system have been really, truly terrible, right? There hadn't been people in place, been treated poorly, and that if they're going to die, they'd rather die with a traditional healer whom they know who can care for them. So I think just opening up some of those discussions and looking finally at what the context, you would have, campaigns, and this is, could not be more true. I'm thinking about situations of radical political polarization, in the North, is that who's giving you the public health message matters as much as the message, right? If you have someone, a politician or a side that you don't trust, or you've experienced your experience has told you that they have not your interests in mind, whatever they say, whatever scientific information is going to be conveyed is going to reverberate around that legacy. And we see that with whether or not people take up vaccines, but we saw that with Ebola about whether or not people would respond to any efforts to respond to the outbreak if they came from people whom they found were untrustworthy. And, ultimately, the outbreak, was contained. And in the last bit, and I'm sorry, I realize I'm going on, I'll talk a little bit about how other technologies that were key to that. But, what really turned the tide was, again, this kind of local sets of initiative. And there was a lot of debates about who is appropriate to be able to respond to the outbreak and who had the appropriate tools. But, I think once you have the kind of population support in order to, protect themselves and to protect their families, then it's much easier to interrupt transmission than, without that kind of local initiative. And, a lot of interesting examples of kind of ways that, there were these compromises between cultural values and kind of biosafety protocol, some really exceptional ways of rethinking kind of, key social events like funerals in ways that was respectful for the cultures in which, it was important to practice them, but also biosafe. And just to remember that that adaptation and those kind of conversations can happen if both sides are kind of rendered open to it. So just a final few slides. Is this okay? Tell me, I can stop now here too. Sorry, I feel like I'm kind of another kind of key point of the outbreak, which made it exceptional, and I think really laid some very interesting foundations to where we are with COVID, was the role of research, and particularly of clinical trials and experimentation around new therapies and products in the context of an outbreak. So, just to remind ourselves that it was really exceptional to be able to trial unlicensed products in an emergency situation. And this is not something that was done previously. It was really Ebola that created the global health context in order to be able to justify this. And I put a quote here from a report consolidated by the WHO ethics group saying, infectious disease outbreaks are periods of great uncertainty. Research is an integral part of the public health response. There's always going to be kind of trial and error. But in the current exceptional experiences of the West Africa Ebola outbreak, researchers have a moral duty to evaluate these interventions in clinical trials that are of the best possible design. So I just want to flag that, previously you would have, of course, if there's a new disease, a new outbreak, you have clinicians, you're trying to gather as much data on the ground, you are going to have a kind of experimental approach because you're in an absence of knowledge. But the idea that you would run full kind of randomized controlled trials for new experimental products in the context of an infectious disease outbreak. I mean, this was really quite radical and quite new for a whole host of reasons. I mean, logistically, ethically, how do you justify doing a blinded trial for populations with a disease that it has incredibly high mortality? It was a thicket, a really complicated set of questions. And I think the key is here, this point, in the extraordinary situations of the Ebola outbreak, and there was a number of kind of contextual factors that made it possible to even think of this as a kind of moral obligation to do clinical trials. One was these kind of hockey stick epidemiological projections saying, this is way out of control. And you had MSF saying, we waited too long to even talk about a vaccine. We thought we can control this. There's no way this can be controlled without a vaccine anymore. So there was a kind of, epidemiological rationale, which said, we don't have anything. We need a vaccine in this moment. The other kind of key piece is that there actually were these candidates, and a lot of them have this kind of platform technology that COVID vaccines have, built on, that were available. They were in preclinical studies, but there was candidates, on the shelf, vaccines, some therapeutics that had been developed during, in the kind of biodefense agenda post-September 11th in the US, this kind of concern about biosecurity, because Ebola had been deemed as a potential, biowarfare virus. Now, there had been outbreaks going on, and it's interesting to compare Ebola as a kind of neglected disease that actually people get, and Ebola as a potential weapon, which received some attention in terms of, biodefense research. So there were these candidates, but they had never been trialed beyond kind of in laboratory animals. Also, a number of discussions around kind of, well, if in a situation where there's a really high mortality rate and there's no therapeutic options and people are dying, well, shouldn't we give people the right to try, right? They should have an experimental opportunity, even if these are really untested and there is no data. If they have no other options, they should gain access to it. And there's kind of debates over whether or not, how far you can push that. But this kind of key watershed moment actually can be tagged to a kind of particular death. Dr. Sheikh Umar Khan, who is Sierra Leone's national expert on viral hemorrhagic fevers, and he caught Ebola. And there was a debate between MSF responders of whether he should be given ZMapp, this experimental therapy. And they decided against it because it wasn't, licensed. And yet a number of the, Western missionaries, first responders, humanitarians had access to it. And it was this incredibly clear, polarizing moment where it was, how is it that this national hero of the response is not given access to this, even the choice to have this, experimental drug therapy, whereas, someone else from the US gets flown back and gets all the treatments to keep them alive. Now there's an interesting, I think, if anyone, knows Paul Farmer, he, has written extensively about how beyond any kind of therapeutics or vaccines or technologies, what really matters for Ebola, what makes the difference in mortality is actually just having, really good, fluid replacement that actually you can bring the mortality right down if you have a really good first line primary healthcare, right? That it doesn't require all of this. But I think the issue of how do we, people saying, it's not right to introduce these experimental vaccines into these populations was really set off against this really stark example of who is going to even be able to give them the option to try them. So we get this kind of shift in debate, to all of a sudden saying, we should do this. We have this outbreak, we have these cases, we should run these trials, we should gather the data that can show whether these vaccines work. The other kind of rush on this that quickly began to happen, and this goes back to the epidemiological models, is that it became quite clear that there weren't going to be that many cases, that actually the outbreak was dropping. And the discussions kind of in January and getting these trials launched at a speed which then was unthinkable. I mean, this is before COVID, but the idea that you would launch a trial within months and get them into stage 3, I mean, this has never been done, right? But there's this added pressure, which is, what window of opportunity is closing. People aren't dying anymore. They aren't getting sick. So we have to launch these trials. And a new set of kind of ethical problems, which is, are these vaccines that we're going to experiment on in these populations, are they going to help these populations? Because actually, it seems that we're controlling this outbreak. Or is this just to produce vaccines for stockpiles for other countries? Who is benefiting from this research? How do we ethically justify that? And it was a lot of tricky maneuvering around and debates about, we should do this because once we have really good, clean data, we can have this technology that's been justified. And that's for future populations, and that's worth it. Now, what ended up really was quite an amazing compromise here was a trial design that was led by the WHO with kind of a different set of partners, which used ring vaccination, which was a way of doing a kind of investigative design where you would target those most at risk, right? You would find an infection and you would test the vaccine among the kind of high risk exposures. Then you would have another cluster. You would identify who is most at risk that would get the vaccine, not immediately, but kind of staggered in time. And they were able to kind of cobble together a design that was both a kind of public health response, but also produce the evidence that would able to say that the vaccine was effective. And it is one of the most, I think, ingenious compromises between how do we enfold a research and investigation, a clinical trial, into a public health response. And in the literature around it, the ring vaccination approach is one that was really helpful in the smallpox eradication campaign, which was the kind of WHO's great triumph, because it was able to use limited resources by targeting those most at risk and vaccinating them in these rings. They used the same model to be able to design a clinical trial, which could produce evidence because it was in this kind of staggered approach to vaccination, and you could compare how many infections were those in the unvaccinated versus the vaccinated, but also that had the kind of ethical heft behind it that this was going to intervene and help in the outbreak. And it did. And, I think the outbreak was coming under control, but the vaccine was a real huge benefit to that. And, in outbreak sense, the vaccine has been this incredibly important tool in response. And just to kind of conclude on kind of where we are with that is that it's still not entirely always straightforward about how those vaccines work as both, as a kind of product that global health investment is put in to say, we want to produce these highly effective vaccines, but that also are going to be used in kind of key outbreak response. Recently in the DRC, and there's been, I think, 3 or 4 outbreaks, and one really significant one in kind of 2019, where they're still trying to generate a sufficient data for, pharmaceutical companies who are investing in these vaccines. And so they're following a protocol. Now, MSF is saying you have a vaccine that works. We need to give it to as many people as possible. And this is Natalie Roberts, who's saying, medical teams should be able to rapidly provide treatments or vaccines based on what they see on the ground. But our capacity to carry out real-time assessments and react accordingly is severely undermined by a rigid system, which is hard to comprehend. It's like giving firefighters a bucket of water to put out a fire, but only allowing them to use 1 cup of water a day. Every day, we see known contacts of confirmed Ebola patients who've not received their dose despite being eligible for vaccination. And the reason why is because there's still this need for regulatory purposes and for, the companies who want to manufacture these is to produce good data, and to produce evidence that this works. And if you're going to produce evidence, you have to do it within a trial protocol, even one that operates in a way that can be in line with a kind of public health response. But that alignment is never so easy. So just to kind of bring us up to where discussions now, I think, again, looking back at the experience of COVAX, I think one of the most lively spaces of kind of thinking about, global health and global health investment now is how, you bring together pharmaceutical company interests and investments into how do you get them to invest in the kinds of tools that might be for situations that are not always, going to generate a huge amount of resources. So, people talk about situations of kind of market failure as the kind of classic problem of global health, is that there are diseases which afflict populations which do not have the kind of financial resources that pharmaceutical companies need to be able to produce them. And I did some work with Ebola survivors, and one of the kind of key market potentials for Ebola vaccine research is actually to target survivors because they have latent infection and they might be seen as a site of onward spread. And there's a couple outbreaks that have been seeded by survivors. And one of the debates is, could you create a better market if you could have a kind of anticipatory prophylactic logic of Ebola vaccination rather than a reactive one, because this could have a more stable investment. Now, there's a number of reasons why kind of pulling out Ebola survivors causes a whole set of issues around, are these people already stigmatized? Are they a public health risk? What does this kind of logic mean? And I think, it remains to be seen of how, where the WHO will sit in terms of endorsing different kinds of vaccine policies, because data is a scarce resource, and to justify large-scale experiments for new vaccine candidates, you have to say, well, we have a vaccine that works. How do we how do we expose people to Ebola vaccines that haven't yet been tried? So there is a complicated set of problems around how you pursue that agenda. The other, and this is my last kind of point here, is, and this brings us back up to the questions of COVAX, is, if the issue, and one of the sustaining ones, is about kind of how do you produce the tools to respond to the kinds of diseases that, might be neglected, but then can be global, what kinds of other sorts of investments are required? And this is an image from Connaught Hospital in Freetown, kind of a before after Ebola in terms of what their laboratories looked like. And, it took, that kind of investment to think about, beyond the tools themselves, who should be making the tools? How do we think about the actual engines of R&D production, which might, introduce different sets of questions about how global health works, how global health markets might be structured. My last slide here is just a very recent conversation between CEPI, which is an organization that funds a lot of this pandemic preparedness, was very much involved with COVAX, and has recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the African CDC to help boost vaccine manufacturing, right? So there is this, as moving the set of questions from how do we increase access to technologies by making sure they make the move from north to south, to saying, can they be made in the South? Like, instead of questions of access and transfer, how do we rethink the context of manufacture to say, well, maybe this won't be, we can kind of rethink what are the kind of institutions that we're looking for and able to enable a response. And I just want to put this last kind of line here from John Nicholson, who's been really pushing for what he calls a new public health order for Africa. And he says that, this partnership with CEPI symbolizes cooperation and collaboration to help respond to infectious disease threats and ensure Africa's health security. Given the impact of COVID-19 on the lives and livelihoods, now is the time to ensure that existing commitments are translated into concrete actions towards a new public health order for Africa. And I think it's a really interesting moment to think about what does that mean? What does a new public health order look like? How does it relate to our ideas of what global health is and can do? And, to bring us back to Professor Prinzak, like, is this a new kind of solidarity that might allow us to think of, new sets of solutions to the kind of problems that, we'll face in the coming century, I guess. Thank you. I'm so sorry to go on at such length. Too many slides as usual.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Kelly. Do we have questions from anyone in the virtual room? Questions, comments? I'm sure Thomas has questions.
No, you're calling me out. I have a comment. It's kind of a question. I really enjoyed this presentation because it opens the mind for a natural scientist quite a bit. And I was struck already by your first slide where you explained equality, equity, and justice. But I sometimes wonder, and going back to the first part of your presentation, you essentially call for solidarity, okay? Solidarity as a means to reach out to people in distant areas of the planet, people who suffer and who may not have the means of access to the same resources as we do. In a way, I find this concept of solidarity running counter to globalization, which, we are happy to have people do our clothing, knitting our clothing in the Far East or in Africa. But as soon as there is a problem, which clearly is a pandemic, it covers or it affects the entire planet, we many of us shut up and close up. And why is that? Is this what I'm trying to understand is, I buy into the concept of solidarity, but isn't it a societal or even philosophical problem at large? Is this the best way we live together? I don't know if I can phrase my question correctly. Even if in countries, so we call for solidarity in countries, when we don't really exert solidarity in our close circle. I would argue that solidarity is much more lived and practiced in daily life in countries in Africa or Asia than in European countries.
Yeah, I think that the key points that you brought up is, who is we? Who do we mean by what are the, through what, whether it's institutions or organizations, does the we become articulated, right? And you're absolutely right. That is through lived practice, right? And I think, we're used to thinking about solidarity. I mean, there are lots of organs and contexts that allow us to think about solidarity as a nation, right? As a kind of national enterprise. And then there are things like, there's the WHO, United Nations, there's other kinds of forms of transnational, expressions of solidarity. But, where else and how do we cultivate the kinds of solidarities that are actually fit for purpose for responding in these situations, right? And I think, the Africa case is interesting. The kind of new public health order as an example, because there's a lot of discussion and, it's been prompted by this R&D question around regionalisms, right? Like, how do we, is there a kind of, trans, Africa or, sets of, if we set up these new hubs of transfer, can we then dislodge different sets of, context for solidarity. Yeah, I mean, I found there was a lot of calls, and none of them remotely as, theoretically nuanced as, Barbara, your work, for solidarity during global health, which really did not do much, right? did not get borne out in any meaningful way. So it raises the question of, where else can we look to really engender those kinds of communities and community responses?
It's kind of, I know Barbara wants to watch the time, but one comment, this global health, global is an optimistic term for us, as long as we can source all goods that we meaning people living in Austria and the UK, we like to have, clothes, cheap TVs. But as soon as there is a crisis coming up, global is not that global anymore. We don't want to think global. And this is the conflict that I have, and I try to find a place where we as citizens could engage in that.
I think your issue seems to be with the absence of solidarity and not with the concept as such. And I think, as Anne was also saying, there is actually a problem, or the question of where we can find examples of solidarity that can effectively address a crisis such as this one, a global crisis, is a very valid question, because the vehicle for institutionalized solidarity has been the nation state. Mm-hmm. And with a transboundary crisis of the kind that we're facing now, that goes across different policy fields, different national borders and other borders, we can still find sort of person-to-person solidarity. Mm-hmm. And here I would not want to say that I believe that solidarity is higher in Nepal or in Sierra Leone than it is in the Netherlands. I think it depends on the particular practice we look at. But person-to-person solidarity has been found in the pandemic in many ways. It has changed its nature a little bit the longer the pandemic took. But institutionalized solidarity has been very, very hard to find. And we see in our own empirical work that we're doing here at the University of Vienna that there's a kind of frustration among many people that the state and public bodies are constantly calling upon people to be solidaristic, to wear their masks, to do this, to do that, where when the state does not provide the circumstances for people to be solidaristic, the state does not enact global solidarity, it doesn't support the most vulnerable, economically vulnerable and socially vulnerable. So I think the question of what kind of engine for institutionalized solidarity could we see in such a crisis is a very, very good one.
Yeah. I mean, and just to say, I think, you really put the finger on it, Thomas, because I think too often we think of these networks, global networks, let's say, of just-in-time manufacturing, of all of the kind of, infrastructures of exchange and production that enable us to think globally, as something entirely separate from the kind of publics and politics that kind of produce social solidarity. And, I think what we saw in the pandemic is, you're right, the minute we couldn't get, the supply chains were cut, or, we couldn't get masks somewhere. I mean, all of the kind of, moral, normative sets of conversations were completely foreclosed because of those infrastructural connections. So, I mean, Barbara's point in terms of, how do we create the engines of vehicle for solidarity is a question that we have to ask alongside of precisely those economic questions, and what infrastructures are available in order, and investments to make those publics real, and to make, those connections possible. So, I think having those 2 points in mind is such an important conversation.
Mm.
So before we end, and there's one question that somebody emailed to me.
Oh,
namely, if how you frame a problem shapes the answers that we give, how should we have framed COVID as a problem?
It's like the $1 million question. I know that is such a good question. And you really that cut to the heart of the lecture, right? Is that how we frame issues. So, what if we had framed this, as a problem of what? Of, local social infrastructure and support. This is a pandemic disease. It's a threat, right? But, I still think about how, these kinds of comparative moments of, shutting the schools, like what kind of values did we come up against? Maybe the more we look at these as a kind of situated set of public health problems, I realize coming from global health, I should always think about global health and that the appeal for solidarity and for sharing. And yet, I find myself more and more trying to kind of scale down a problem in terms of its public health realities. That didn't answer the question, but I will be thinking about it long.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
I would like to, before we close for today, I would like to remind everyone and announce next week's lecture. It's at the same time, in the same place. We will have Dr. Sarah Silverstein. She's at the University of Connecticut. She will be our guest speaker in the session, Locking Down on Us, Societal Responses in Health Crises. And picking up some of the topics that Professor Kelly addressed today, and Dr. Silverstein will talk about how societies have reacted to health crises in the past, what we should have learned from health crises in the past, what we should learn from this one that we're still in. The next week's session will be moderated by a colleague of mine here at the University of Vienna, Professor Janina Kerr. And I'm very, very happy that you've been here today, and I shall look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much for being part of this today. And thank you again to you, Anne.
Thank you guys so much. I'm so grateful for the chance to thank you.
Same here.